Welcome to Forbidden Love Story channel. Imagine a quiet seaside town, a perfect life, until one man's visit ignites a forbidden fire that burns it all to ash. What starts as a shiver of unease explodes into betrayal, tearing my family apart. Will I drown in guilt or find a way back from the ruins? Stick around. This is a tale of love, loss, and redemption you won't forget. Now let's dive into the chaos together. The salty breeze swept through the quaint coastal town of Bar Harbor, Maine, whispering secrets through the towering pines that hugged our weathered, clapboard house. I'm Sarah, a 32-year-old woman with a life stitched together by routine, married to Daniel, 35, a fisherman with calloused hands and a steady heart, and mother to our two kids, Lily and Ethan, who filled our days with chaotic joy. Life here was predictable, a quiet rhythm of crashing waves and seagull cries, until that crisp October evening when Daniel's father, Robert, arrived. Robert, a rugged 58-year-old widower with a face carved by years of solitude, wasn't a stranger, but his visits were rare, like storms that rolled in without warning. He'd called ahead, his gravelly voice crackling through the phone, but nothing prepared me for the jolt that hit me when I opened the door. His piercing grey eyes locked onto mine, sharp and unreadable, slicing through the calm I'd clung to. A shiver raced down my spine, not from the chilly air, but from something deeper, something restless stirring in my chest. He stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood, and the air thickened with an unspoken weight. I forced a smile, my lips trembling slightly, and muttered a shaky, "Good to see you, Robert." He nodded, his expression cool but laced with a flicker of something I couldn't name, curiosity, maybe, or a shadow of intent. Daniel clapped his dad on the back, oblivious to the tremor rippling through me, and the kids squealed, tugging at Robert's coat. But I felt it, an invisible thread tugging at my senses, pulling me toward him despite the absurdity of it. Dinner unfolded in a haze of clinking plates and Daniel's hearty laughter as he recounted tales of the sea. The kids scampered off to bed, leaving the three of us in the glow of the fireplace, its crackling flames casting jagged shadows across the room. I perched on the edge of the couch, my fingers twisting the hem of my sweater, trying to anchor myself. Robert sat across from me, silent, his presence looming like a storm cloud swelling on the horizon. Every time I dared glance up, his gaze met mine, steady, magnetic, and unnervingly intense. My heart thudded, loud and erratic, drowning out Daniel's voice. The night deepened, and the room pulsed with a tension I couldn't shake. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a gnawing unease that clawed at my insides. I wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to exhaustion or the wine, but Robert's eyes held me captive, peeling back layers I'd kept buried. When Daniel suggested we turn in, relief flooded me, but it was chased by a sharp pang of disappointment, wild and irrational, that I couldn't explain. I followed Daniel upstairs, my steps heavy, leaving Robert alone with the dying embers. But sleep eluded me. I lay there, restless, his gaze branded into my mind, a haunting echo that refused to fade. Morning broke with a fragile calm. Daniel bustled around, planning the day while I moved through the motions, coffee, toast, forced smiles. But Robert's presence lingered, a quiet force shadowing every room. When Daniel left for the docks and the kids scampered to school, the house fell silent, save for the distant crash of waves. I busied myself with dishes, scrubbing harder than necessary, desperate to drown out the chaos brewing inside me. Then I heard it, his footsteps, deliberate and slow, approaching the kitchen. My breath hitched, and my hands froze in the soapy water. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and smooth, slicing through the stillness like a blade. I flinched, my pulse roaring in my ears, and turned to face him. He stood closer than I'd expected, his frame filling the doorway, his eyes boring into mine with a depth that made my knees weak. The air crackled, charged with something unspoken, something dangerous. We stood there, locked in a silent standoff, and I felt it. A pull, fierce and undeniable, tugging me toward a precipice I hadn't known existed. My chest tightened, fear and fascination warring within me. This wasn't just a visit. This was the beginning of something I couldn't control. The kitchen shrank under Robert's gaze, the salty tang of the Maine coast seeping through the cracked window, no match for the storm brewing in my chest. His voice, Sarah, cut through the silence like a jagged shard of glass, low and smooth, reverberating in the hollow space between us. My hands, slick with dishwater, gripped the sink's edge, knuckles whitening as I fought to steady the tremor ripping through me. The distant crash of waves pounded in my ears, but it couldn't mute the wild thudding of my heart, a frantic rhythm that betrayed every ounce of calm I'd clung to. I turned, slow and unsteady, and met his piercing grey eyes, storm dark, unyielding, simmering with a heat that pinned me in place. He stood there, too close, his rugged frame filling the doorway like a wall of shadow and intent. The air crackled, thick with an unspoken charge that made my skin prickle and my breath hitch. "Robert!" I rasped, my voice a frail thread snapping under the weight of his stare. I wanted to ask why he was here, to drown the tension in small talk, but my tongue felt leaden, useless. He stepped forward, his boots thudding against the worn floorboards, and the space between us collapsed into a taut, trembling wire. My pulse roared, a caged beast clawing at my ribs, and I cursed the way my body leaned toward him, drawn, reckless, defiant. "You're shaking," he said, his tone a velvet growl that slid under my skin, stirring the chaos I'd tried to bury. His eyes raked over me, slow and deliberate, igniting a fire that licked at my nerves. "Is it me?" The question wasn't innocent, it was a dare, a spark tossed onto dry tinder, and I felt the heat flare in my cheeks, sharp and accusing. I opened my mouth to deny it, to fling back a lie, but the words choked in my throat, strangled by the truth screaming through me. "I'm just tired," I managed, turning back to the sink, plunging my hands into the suds as if they could wash away the madness seizing me. The clatter of dishes was a flimsy shield, a desperate bid to reclaim control, but it shattered as his shadow loomed closer. His breath brushed the back of my neck, steady, warm, intoxicating, and a shiver raced down my spine, fierce and unbidden. I hated it, hated how it woke something raw inside me, something I'd locked away beneath years of routine and vows. The room spun, the walls closing in, and I gripped the counter harder, willing him to leave, to break this suffocating spell. "Sarah," he murmured again, softer now, a whisper that coiled around my heart and squeezed. The dish slipped from my fingers, splashing into the water, and I whirled around, my chest heaving, my resolve fraying at the edges. He was closer, too close, his face inches from mine, his scent of salt and cedar flooding my senses, drowning me. His eyes darkened, a tempest swirling within them, and I saw it. A hunger, fierce and unguarded, mirroring the ache clawing at my core. My breath caught, a ragged gasp, and I felt the ground shift beneath me, treacherous and alive. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling, raw with fear and a yearning I couldn't name. His hand lifted, slow and deliberate, hovering near my cheek, and the air between us thickened, pulsing with a danger I couldn't escape. "I don't know," he said, his voice rough, scraping against the silence like sandpaper. "But I feel it too." His fingers brushed my skin, light, tentative, electric, and a jolt surged through me, searing my nerves, stealing my breath. I flinched, my lips parting, and his gaze dropped to them, lingering with an intensity that made my stomach twist into knots. I should have stepped back, should have shoved him away, screamed Daniel's name, anything to snap the thread pulling me under. But I didn't. My body betrayed me, leaning into his touch, and his hand slid to the back of my neck, firm and sure. Time slowed, the world narrowing to the heat of his palm, the storm in his eyes, the pounding of my heart. Then he moved, swift, decisive, his lips crashing against mine in a kiss that exploded through me like a thunderclap. It was fierce, desperate, a collision of need that devoured every shred of restraint. I kissed him back, my hands fisting in his jacket, pulling him closer as if I could merge into him and escape the guilt tearing at my soul. The taste of him, salt and shadow, flooded me, igniting a fire that roared through my veins, wild and unstoppable. His hands gripped me, strong and searching, pressing me against the counter as the kiss deepened, a tangle of tongues and ragged breaths. Every touch was a spark, every movement a blaze, and I surrendered to it, lost in the reckless thrill of something so wrong it felt like salvation. The kitchen faded, Daniel's laughter a distant echo, the kids' voices swallowed by the tidal wave crashing over me. It was just us, burning, breaking, alive in a way I hadn't been in years. When we broke apart, gasping, the air shimmered with the aftermath. My lips throbbed, swollen and alive, and my chest heaved as I stared at him, wide-eyed, reeling. His face was flushed, his breath uneven, but his eyes held a tempest. Passion, regret, a flicker of dread. "Sarah!" he rasped, his voice raw. "We can't—" But I lunged forward, silencing him with another kiss, harder, hungrier, chasing the fire before it consumed me whole. His arms tightened around me, a lifeline in the chaos, and I felt the edge of the abyss beckoning, sharp and irresistible. The day blurred after that, a fog of guilt and adrenaline. I moved through chores like a phantom, my mind replaying the kiss in vivid, torturous flashes. The press of his lips, the heat of his hands, the way my body had sung under his touch. Daniel came home, his voice a dull hum, as he talked of fish and tides, and I nodded, my smiles brittle, my eyes darting to Robert across the room. He was calm, infuriatingly so, but I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze lingered when Daniel turned away. The air between us pulsed, thick with secrets, and I hated how it thrilled me, how it made me feel seen, wanted, alive. That night, I slipped outside, the cold biting my skin as I stood by the rocky shore, the ocean churning dark and restless. Robert's footsteps crunched behind me and I turned, my heart lurching as he stepped into the moonlight. "We shouldn't be here," I whispered, my voice breaking. He nodded, but his eyes burned, pulling me under. "I know," he said, his voice a gravelly plea, "but I can't stay away." And neither could I. The ocean roared its restless anthem beyond the cliffs of Bar Harbor, a wild symphony that mirrored the chaos churning inside me. I stood in the kitchen the next morning, the taste of Robert's kiss still searing my lips, a phantom burn that refused to fade. My hands moved mechanically, wiping counters, stacking plates, while my mind spun, a whirlwind of guilt and exhilaration tearing through me. Daniel had left for the docks at dawn, his cheerful whistle echoing down the hall, oblivious to the fracture splintering our life. The kids, Lily and Ethan, had tumbled out the door to school, their laughter a fading echo, leaving the house silent, too silent, save for the heavy thud of my heart. Robert emerged from the guest room, his presence a thunderclap in the stillness. I felt him before I saw him, a shiver rippling down my spine as his shadow stretched across the floor. "Morning," he said, his voice a gravelly murmur that raked over my nerves, igniting a spark I couldn't smother. I turned, my breath catching, and found him leaning against the counter, his grey eyes locked on mine, stormy, piercing, brimming with a hunger that mirrored the ache gnawing at my core. My fingers tightened around the dishcloth, twisting it into a knot, as if it could anchor me against the tidal wave pulling me under. "Morning," I echoed, my voice a fragile whisper, trembling with the weight of what we'd done, what we couldn't undo. The memory of his lips crashed through me, fierce and unyielding, a wildfire that had scorched every boundary I'd built. I wanted to hate him, to shove him out the door and reclaim the steady life I'd known. But my body betrayed me, humming with a reckless thrill I couldn't silence. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing the hardwood, and the air thickened, charged with a tension that crackled like static before a storm. "You're avoiding me," he said, his tone low and probing, slicing through my defenses. His eyes searched mine, peeling back the layers I'd tried to rebuild overnight, and I felt exposed, raw, vulnerable, alive in a way that terrified me. "Don't," he added, softer, a plea wrapped in command, and my chest tightened, a vice of heat and dread squeezing the air from my lungs. "I'm not," I lied, turning away, my hands plunging back into the sink as if the suds could wash away the truth. But he moved closer, his heat pressing against my back, and I froze, my pulse roaring in my ears. His hand hovered near my shoulder, hesitant, then settled there. Warm, firm, electric, a jolt surged through me, igniting every nerve, and I gasped, the sound sharp and betraying. "Robert, please," I whispered, my voice breaking, a desperate plea for him to stop. Or to keep going, I couldn't tell which. "Please what?" he murmured, his breath brushing my ear, sending a shiver racing down my spine. His fingers tightened, pulling me back against him, and I felt the hard planes of his chest, the steady thud of his heart sinking with mine. "Tell me to leave, Sarah, and I will." His voice was rough, raw with a longing that mirrored my own, and I hated how it unraveled me, how it stripped me bare and left me trembling on the edge of something vast and perilous. I should have said it, should have shoved him away, screamed for Daniel, for sanity, for anything to snap this thread binding us. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned in his arms, my hands fisting in his shirt, and met his gaze. Dark, stormy, ablaze with a fire that consumed me. "I can't," I breathed, my voice a ragged confession, and that was all it took. His lips crashed against mine, fierce and possessive, a kiss that devoured me whole. I kissed him back, hungry and desperate, my fingers digging into his shoulders as if I could anchor myself in the chaos. The kitchen spun, the world dissolving into a blur of heat and need. His hands roamed, strong and searching, pressing me against the counter as the kiss deepened, a tangle of tongues and ragged breaths that stole my sanity. Every touch was a spark, every movement a blaze, and I surrendered to it, lost in the reckless thrill of something so wrong it felt like destiny. The taste of him, salt and shadow, flooded me, a tidal wave crashing through my veins, and I clung to him, drowning in the fire we'd ignited. When we broke apart, gasping, my lips throbbed, swollen and alive, and my chest heaved as I stared at him, wide-eyed and reeling. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice raw, his hands framing my face, "we're playing with fire." His eyes held a storm, passion, guilt, a flicker of fear, and I felt it too, a dread coiling in my gut, sharp and cold. But the heat between us burned brighter, drowning it out, and I yanked him back, kissing him again, harder, hungrier, chasing the blaze before it consumed us both. The day unraveled in a haze of stolen moments. Every glance was a spark, every brush of his hand a flame, and I moved through chores like a ghost, my mind replaying his touch in vivid, torturous flashes. Daniel came home, his voice a dull hum as he talked of nets and storms, and I nodded, my smiles brittle, my eyes darting to Robert across the table. He was calm, maddeningly so, but I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his gaze lingered when Daniel wasn't looking. The air pulsed, thick with secrets, and I hated how it thrilled me, how it made me feel seen, wanted, alive in a way I'd forgotten. That night, after Daniel and the kids slept, I slipped downstairs, the house cloaked in shadow and silence. Robert was there, standing by the fireplace, the dying embers casting a glow across his rugged features. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble that shook me to my core, and I crossed the room, drawn like a moth to flame. His arms opened and I fell into them, our lips colliding in a kiss that was all heat and desperation, a release of everything we'd held back. "We shouldn't," I whispered against his mouth, my voice trembling, but my hands betrayed me, sliding under his shirt, tracing the hard lines of his chest. "I know," he growled, his hands gripping my hips, pulling me closer, "but I can't stop." His lips trailed down my neck, hot and urgent, and a moan escaped me, raw and unbidden, igniting a fire that roared through my veins. The room spun, the shadows dancing as we stumbled toward the couch, a tangle of limbs and need, the world shrinking to the heat of his skin against mine. His hands were everywhere, strong, possessive, peeling away my defenses as I arched into him, lost in the blaze. My sweater hit the floor, his shirt followed, and the air crackled with the intensity of our surrender. Every touch was electric, every kiss a spark, and I felt the edge of reason slipping away, replaced by a hunger so fierce it consumed me. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice a ragged plea, his eyes dark with a passion that mirrored my own, and I pulled him down, our bodies pressing together, a collision of fire and shadow that drowned out everything else. Time blurred, the night stretching into an endless dance of heat and longing. His hands explored, igniting trails of fire across my skin, and I responded with a fervor I didn't recognize. Wild, untamed, alive. The couch creaked beneath us, the fire's glow fading as we lost ourselves in each other, a moment of unity that eclipsed the guilt clawing at my soul. When we finally stilled, breathless and trembling, I lay in his arms, my heart pounding in sync with his, the air heavy with the weight of what we'd done. "We can't go back," I whispered, my voice raw, my fingers tracing the lines of his face. He nodded, his eyes stormy with a mix of passion and regret, and I felt it too, a dread coiling beneath the heat, sharp and relentless. "I know," he said, his voice a gravelly confession, "but I don't want to." His arms tightened around me, a lifeline in the chaos, and I buried my face in his chest, clinging to the fire before it burned us to ash. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, the sky a mirror to the turmoil roiling inside me. Daniel bustled around, oblivious, while I moved through the motions, coffee, toast, forced smiles, my body still humming with Robert's touch. He lingered in the background, a quiet force shadowing every room, his gaze a constant pull I couldn't escape. When Daniel left for the docks and the kids scampered to school, the house fell silent. And I knew we were alone again, teetering on the edge of something vast and perilous. "Sarah," Robert said, stepping into the kitchen, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I turned, my breath catching, and found him closer than I'd expected, his eyes blazing with a fire that matched mine. "We need to talk," he said, but his hand reached for mine, warm and firm, and the air crackled, charged with a need that drowned out his words. I stepped toward him, my resolve crumbling, and his arms enveloped me, pulling me into a kiss that was all heat and desperation, a surrender to the blaze we couldn't extinguish. The day blurred into a fevered dance of stolen moments, kisses in shadowed corners, hands brushing against skin, a hunger that consumed us both. Every touch was a spark, every glance a flame, and I felt the edge of the abyss looming, sharp and inevitable. "Robert," I whispered, my voice trembling as we stood in the living room, the afternoon light slanting through the windows. "This is going to destroy us." He nodded, his eyes dark with a mix of passion and dread, but his hands tightened on my waist, pulling me closer. "Maybe," he murmured, his lips brushing mine, "but I'd rather burn with you than live without this." The words hit me like a thunderbolt, igniting a fire that roared through me, fierce and unstoppable. I surged against him, our lips crashing together, a kiss that was all heat and need, a declaration of something we couldn't name. His hand slid under my shirt, strong and possessive, and I gasped, arching into him as the world dissolved into a blur of sensation. The living room faded, the house a distant echo, and it was just us, burning, breaking, alive in a way I'd never known. We stumbled upstairs, a tangle of limbs and desperation, the hallway a blur as he pressed me against the wall, his lips trailing fire down my neck. My hands roamed, greedy and reckless, peeling away his shirt as we reached my bedroom, the room I shared with Daniel, now a battlefield of betrayal. The door slammed shut, and he lifted me, strong and sure, carrying me to the bed as our kisses deepened, a storm of passion that drowned out the guilt clawing at my soul. The mattress dipped beneath us, his weight pinning me as his hands explored, igniting trails of fire across my skin. I arched into him, my fingers digging into his shoulders, a moan escaping me as the blaze consumed us. Every touch was electric, every kiss a spark, and I felt the last of my defenses crumble, replaced by a hunger so fierce it redefined me. "Sarah!" he growled, his voice raw, his eyes dark with a passion that mirrored my own, and I pulled him closer, our bodies merging in a collision of fire and shadow that eclipsed everything else. Time dissolved, the afternoon stretching into an endless dance of heat and longing. His hands were everywhere, strong, possessive, peeling away my clothes as I surrendered to the fire, lost in the thrill of something so wrong it felt like salvation. The bed creaked, the world shrinking to the heat of his skin against mine, and I felt the edge of reason slip away, replaced by a unity that burned brighter than any vow I'd made. When we finally stilled, breathless and trembling, I lay in his arms, my heart pounding in sync with his, the air heavy with the weight of our surrender. "We can't hide this," I whispered, my voice raw, my fingers tracing the lines of his face. He nodded, his eyes stormy with a mix of passion and regret. And I felt it too, a dread coiling beneath the heat, sharp and relentless. "I know," he said, his voice a gravelly confession, "but I don't want to stop." His arms tightened around me, a lifeline in the chaos, and I buried my face in his chest, clinging to the fire before it burned us to ash. The hours bled into dusk, and I knew every stolen moment, every reckless touch was a step toward ruin, but the blaze between us burned too bright, too fierce, and I couldn't pull away. The air in the house hung heavy, thick with the salt of the sea, and the weight of secrets that clung to every corner like damp fog. It was Robert's birthday, a day I'd planned with trembling hands and a racing heart. A quiet celebration meant to mask the wildfire raging inside me. The kids, Lily and Ethan, buzzed around the dining room, their chatter a fragile shield against the storm I knew was coming. I'd spent the morning in a fevered haze, slipping into town under the guise of errands. My destination wasn't the grocery store, but a boutique tucked away on a side street, its windows dark and discreet. There, I'd found it, a sleek, daring outfit, black and bold, with a skirt that barely grazed my thighs and a mask that promised anonymity. It wasn't just a gift for Robert, it was a declaration, a reckless vow woven into every stitch. I hid it in the depths of my closet, my fingers trembling as I scribbled a note. "Meet me tonight, upstairs, after they sleep," and slipped it into his jacket pocket, my pulse a frantic drumbeat. Dinner unfolded in a blur of forced smiles and clinking glasses. Daniel, oblivious, raised a toast to his father, his voice warm and steady, cutting through me like a blade. "To Robert, here's to family," he said, and I choked on the irony, my wineglass trembling in my hand. Robert sat across from me, his grey eyes flickering with a heat only I could read, a secret flame dancing beneath his calm facade. The kids giggled, oblivious, and I played my part, nodding, laughing, a hollow shell of the wife I'd once been. But every glance from Robert was a spark, every brush of his foot under the table a jolt, and I felt the fire between us smouldering, ready to erupt. The evening stretched taut, a wire pulled to its breaking point. Daniel cleared the table, humming a tune, while I moved like a ghost, my mind racing with the night ahead. The kids scampered upstairs, their footsteps fading, and I excused myself to check on them, my voice a brittle lie. In the bedroom, I locked the door, my hands shaking as I peeled off my sweater and slipped into the outfit. The fabric clung to me, tight and unyielding, a second skin that screamed everything I couldn't say. I adjusted the mask, its edges cool against my flushed cheeks, and stared at myself in the mirror. A stranger, wild and untamed, staring back. The house settled into silence, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. I waited, my breath shallow, my heart a frantic thud against my ribs. Then I heard it, Robert's footsteps, slow and deliberate, climbing the stairs. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, his eyes widening as they raked over me, dark with a hunger that stole my breath. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice a gravelly plea, and I moved toward him, my body trembling with a mix of fear and exhilaration. "Happy birthday," I whispered, my voice low and unsteady, and I stepped closer, the space between us shrinking to nothing. His hands found my waist, strong and possessive, pulling me against him as our lips collided in a kiss that was all heat and desperation. The mask slipped slightly, but I didn't care. I was lost in him, in the fire that roared through me, fierce and unstoppable. His fingers dug into my hips, lifting me, and I wrapped my legs around him, a moan escaping me as we stumbled toward the bed, a tangle of limbs and need. The room spun, the world dissolving into a blur of sensation, his lips trailing fire down my neck, his hands peeling away the fabric as I arched into him, greedy and reckless. Every touch was a spark, every kiss a blaze, and I felt the edge of reason slip away, replaced by a hunger so fierce it consumed me. "Sarah," he growled, his voice raw, his eyes dark with a passion that mirrored my own, and I pulled him closer, our bodies pressing together in a collision of fire and shadow that drowned out everything else. Time blurred, the night stretching into an endless dance of heat and longing. The bed creaked beneath us, the air thick with the scent of salt and sweat, and I surrendered to the thrill, lost in the reckless abandon of something so wrong it felt like salvation. His hands were everywhere, strong, urgent, igniting trails of fire across my skin, and I responded with a fervor I didn't recognize, wild and untamed. We were a storm, a force of nature, and I clung to him, drowning in the blaze we'd unleashed. Then the world shattered, the door slammed open with a deafening crash, and I froze, my heart lurching into my throat. Daniel stood there, his silhouette stark against the hallway light, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. The air turned to ice, the heat between Robert and me snuffed out in an instant, as his eyes, those warm, steady eyes I'd loved, burned with a fury I'd never seen. "What the hell is this?" he roared, his voice a thunderclap that shook the walls, raw and guttural, slicing through me like a blade. I scrambled back, my hands clutching the sheets, the mask dangling uselessly around my neck. "Daniel!" I choked, my voice a ragged gasp, but he lunged forward, his fist slamming into Robert's jaw with a sickening crack. Robert stumbled, blood trickling from his lip, but he didn't fight back, not really, just raised his arms to deflect the blows raining down. "You bastard!" Daniel snarled, his voice breaking, a howl of betrayal that tore at my soul. "My own father!" The room erupted into chaos, fists flying, furniture toppling, the air thick with grunts and the metallic tang of blood. I screamed. "Stop it!" my voice shrill and desperate, but it was swallowed by the violence, a futile cry against the storm I'd unleashed. Daniel shoved Robert against the wall, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a pain that gutted me. "And you!" he spat, turning to me, his gaze a dagger of hatred piercing my heart. "You're worse than him." Tears streamed down my face, hot and relentless, as I stumbled to my feet, the outfit clinging to me like a mark of shame. "Daniel, please," I begged, my voice cracking, but he cut me off, his hands slashing through the air. "Get out," he growled, his tone chillingly calm, a death knell that froze my blood. Both of you. Now I never want to see you again." His words landed like blows, each one a fracture in the life I'd destroyed, and I felt the ground crumble beneath me, a void opening wide. Robert wiped the blood from his mouth, his eyes dark with a mix of regret and defiance, and nodded once, a silent acceptance. I stood there, trembling, my chest heaving as the weight of his command crashed over me. "Daniel, I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice a broken sob. But he turned away, his shoulders rigid, a wall of silence slamming down between us. There was no forgiveness there, no mercy, just a wound too deep to heal. We moved in a daze, gathering what we could, clothes, keys, fragments of a life now ash. The house loomed around us, a tomb of memories, as we stumbled into the night, the cold biting my skin through the thin fabric I still wore. Robert's truck rumbled to life, and I climbed in, my hands shaking, my mind a blur of guilt and despair. He drove in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the road, and I stared out the window, the dark pines blurring into a smear of shadow and loss. The town faded behind us, the ocean's roar a distant lament, and I felt it, a hollow ache spreading through me, sharp and relentless. We'd burned too bright, too fast, and now the flames had consumed everything. Daniel, the kids, the home I'd known. Robert's hand rested on the wheel, blood crusted on his knuckles, and I wanted to reach for him, to cling to the fire that had brought us here. But the space between us felt vast, unbridgeable. We stopped at a motel on the outskirts, its neon sign flickering like a dying star. The room was stark, cold, a temporary refuge from the wreckage we'd left behind. I sank onto the bed, my body trembling, my chest tight with a grief I couldn't name. Robert stood by the window, his silhouette a jagged outline against the night, and the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice low and rough, "we can't go back." "I know," I whispered, my voice raw, my hands twisting in my lap. The fire between us still smouldered, a faint ember in the ashes, but it was overshadowed by the weight of what we'd lost. Daniel's face, his rage, his pain, haunted me, a spectre I couldn't escape. We were alone now, bound by our sin, and the road ahead loomed dark and uncertain, a path forged in fire and paved with ruin. The motel room stank of despair, its faded walls closing in like a cage around my shattered life. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a sickly glow, and I slumped on the bed, my hands shaking, my chest carved out by a grief that gnawed with every breath. Robert loomed by the window, his silhouette a dark, unyielding shadow. The blaze that had consumed us, wild, reckless, alive, felt cold now, smothered by Daniel's voice ringing in my ears. "Get out! I never want to see you again." The memory sliced through me, a jagged wound of guilt, and I pressed my fists to my eyes, desperate to erase his betrayed glare. "We broke everything," I whispered, my voice cracking, raw with anguish. Robert turned, his grey eyes dull, emptied of the storm that once drew me in. "Yeah," he grunted, his tone a flat, gravelly echo, and stepped closer, but the air between us was frigid, unbridgeable. My heart clenched, a sharp pang of loss, and I looked away, the silence swallowing me whole. We lay apart that night, the bed a battlefield of unspoken ruin, his presence a distant hum I couldn't reach. Dawn bled through the curtains, grey and merciless. Robert rose, wordless, grabbing his jacket with a cold efficiency that gutted me. "Business," he muttered, eyes averted, and left, the door's click a final blow. Alone, I sat, the fire we'd chased reduced to ash, Daniel's pain haunting me, Robert slipping away. The darkness ahead yawned wide, and I knew this was just the start of the fall. The motel room was a crypt, its stale air choking me with every ragged breath I drew. The neon sign outside sputtered, its faint buzz a mocking pulse against the silence, and I sat on the bed's edge, my hands twisting in my lap, my chest a cavern where hope had once flickered. Robert was gone, His footsteps had faded down the hall that morning, a quiet exodus that carved a deeper void inside me. The room's shadows stretched long and jagged, clawing at the walls like the guilt that gnawed at my soul. Daniel's face haunted me, his rage, his pain, the way his voice had cracked with betrayal. "I never want to see you again." The words looped in my mind, a relentless dirge, each syllable a lash that flayed me raw. I'd lost him, lost Lily and Ethan, their laughter now a ghost echoing through a home I'd torched. Tears burned my eyes, hot and merciless, but I let them fall this time, soaking the cheap sheets as sobs tore from my throat, wild, guttural, a howl of anguish I couldn't stifle. Robert's absence was a fresh wound, sharp and bleeding. The fire we'd chased, the reckless, blazing heat that had consumed us, had guttered out, leaving only ash and a cold, unyielding emptiness. I'd clung to him, desperate for a tether in the chaos, but his muttered business and averted eyes had severed that thread. My fingers traced the spot where his hand had rested, a phantom warmth that mocked me now, and I wondered, had it ever been real, or just a fevered dream I'd conjured to escape my own skin? The day blurred into a grey haze. I paced the room, my steps unsteady, the carpet rough beneath my bare feet. The mirror above the dresser reflected a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed, a woman stripped bare by her own choices. I stared at her, at me, and felt a surge of loathing, bitter, scalding, rising in my throat. I'd betrayed Daniel, destroyed my family, and for what? A fleeting blaze with a man who'd walked away without a backward glance. The thought twisted in my gut, a knife of self-reproach, and I turned away, my fists clenched, nails biting into my palms. Night fell, heavy and oppressive, the darkness seeping through the curtains like ink. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, its cracks a map of my fractured life. Sleep eluded me, chased away by memories that stabbed without mercy. The kitchen kiss, the couch's fire, the bedroom's chaos. Each moment was a shard of glass, slicing deeper, and I pressed my hands to my chest, trying to hold myself together as the void widened, swallowing me whole. Robert's voice echoed in my skull. "I'd rather burn with you." But it rang hollow now, a lie exposed by his absence. Days bled together, a relentless march of solitude. I stayed in that room, a prisoner of my own despair, the walls closing in with every tick of the clock. The motel's hum became my heartbeat, its grime a second skin I couldn't shed. I didn't eat, didn't leave. Food turned to ash in my mouth, and the world beyond the door felt like a foreign land I no longer belonged to. My phone sat silent, a lifeline I couldn't touch, and I wondered if Daniel had told the kids, if their small faces now held confusion or hate where love had once been. Then it came. A knock, sharp and jarring, slicing through the fog. I stumbled to the door, my heart lurching with a flicker of hope. Robert. But it died as I opened it. A courier stood there, his face blank, handing me an envelope that felt like lead in my hands. I tore it open, my fingers trembling, and the words leaped out. Divorce petition. Daniel's signature stared back, cold and final, a guillotine dropping on the life I'd known. Tucked inside was a note, his handwriting stark and trembling. "Sarah, you're dead to me. Forget us like I'll forget you." The room spun, the paper slipping from my grasp as a wail ripped from my chest. Raw, primal, a sound of breaking. I sank to the floor, my knees buckling, the weight of his words crushing me. He was gone, truly gone, and with him, Lily and Ethan, the family I'd shattered. The void swallowed me, dark and endless, and I curled into myself, sobbing until my throat burned, until there was nothing left but a hollow ache. Robert returned that night, his footsteps a faint echo in the hall. I looked up, tear-streaked and ragged, as he stepped inside, his face shadowed, his eyes distant. "Sarah," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the fire that had once bound us, and I felt it, the last thread snapping. He sat across from me, the space between us a chasm, and I saw the truth. We were strangers now, bound only by the wreckage we'd wrought. "I can't stay," he muttered, his gaze averted, and I nodded, too broken to argue, too empty to care. He left again, the doors click a quiet epitaph, and I sat there, alone, the envelope crumpled beside me. The fire was gone, the ashes cold, and the road ahead stretched dark and unyielding. I'd lost everything: Daniel, the kids, Robert, myself, and the silence roared, a deafening void I couldn't escape. This wasn't living, it was surviving, a ghost haunting the ruins of a life I'd burned to the ground. The motel room was a tomb, its silence a shroud that smothered me in the days after Robert's final departure. The divorce papers lay crumpled on the floor, Daniel's words, "You're dead to me," a relentless echo carving deeper into my soul. The neon sign's buzz had faded to a dull hum, and I sat on the bed, my hands limp, my chest a cavern where regret festered like an open wound. The world beyond the door felt like a distant dream, unreachable and cruel. I'd lost everything: Daniel's steady warmth, Lily's bright giggles, Ethan's boundless energy, Robert's fleeting passion, and the void swallowed me, dark and unyielding. Days blurred into weeks, a grey fog of despair I couldn't shake. I barely moved, the mattress sagging beneath me, my reflection in the cracked mirror a stranger, pale, gaunt, eyes dulled by a grief that gnawed without mercy. Food turned to dust in my mouth, sleep brought nightmares of Daniel's rage and Robert's retreating shadow, and I drifted, a ghost trapped in the ruins of my own making. But something shifted, a faint spark, buried deep, flickering against the darkness. I couldn't stay here, couldn't let the void claim me entirely. One morning, the sun pierced the curtains, a sliver of gold slicing through the gloom, and I forced myself up. My legs trembling, my breath shallow. I packed what little I had, clothes, the divorce papers, a shred of resolve, and left the motel. The doors creak a quiet farewell to the abyss I'd wallowed in. The air outside bit my skin, crisp and unforgiving, but it woke me, a jolt to a heart I'd thought dead. I found a small apartment across town, a cramped box with peeling paint and a single window overlooking a barren street. It was nothing like the clappered house by the sea, but it was mine, a fragile foothold in a world I'd been cast out of. The first nights were brutal, the silence deafening, Daniel's note a spectre in my mind. I'd sit on the floor, knees drawn to my chest, tears streaming as I replayed every mistake. The kitchen kiss, the bedroom blaze, the shattering of trust. Guilt was a relentless tide, crashing over me, but beneath it, a whisper grew. I had to keep going. I sought help, a desperate lifeline. The therapist's office was stark, her voice calm but piercing, peeling back the layers I'd buried. "Tell me," she said, and the words spilled, raw, jagged, a flood of pain and shame. I spoke of Daniel's love, Robert's pull, the fire that had consumed me, and the wreckage left behind. She listened, her eyes steady, and offered no absolution, only a mirror. "You can't change it, Sarah, but you can live with it." The truth stung, sharp and unyielding, but it planted a seed, a faint hope that I could claw my way back. Healing was a slog, a battle fought in inches. I found work at a diner, the clatter of plates and hum of voices a balm against the silence, the smell of coffee, the warmth of the stove, the fleeting smiles of strangers. They were small, fragile threads weaving me back into the world. I'd catch myself staring out the window, to see a distant glimmer, and feel the ache, Lily and Ethan, lost to me forever. But I'd grip the counter, steadying the tremble, and keep moving. Each day was a brick, heavy but deliberate, building something new. Nightmares lingered, Daniel's face a haunting spectre, but they softened over time, the edges blurring. I learned to breathe through the pain, to let it sit beside me rather than rule me. The therapist's words echoed, "Forgive yourself," and I tried, faltering, stumbling, but trying. I'd walk the streets at dusk, the mountain air cool against my skin, and find solace in the quiet, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of gulls, a rhythm that soothed the chaos within. Months passed, a slow thaw. I'd stand in the diner, pouring coffee, and catch a glimpse of light, my own reflection in the glass. Not radiant, but steady. The guilt didn't vanish. It was a scar etched deep, a reminder of what I'd done, but it no longer defined me. I'd lost Daniel, the kids, Robert, everything. But I'd found something else. A flicker of strength, a will to endure. The past was a weight, but it didn't have to crush me. One evening, wiping down tables, I paused, the sunset painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. It was beautiful, raw, a moment that pierced the numbness. I thought of Daniel, hoped he'd found peace, and of Lily and Ethan, praying they'd grow strong despite my absence. Robert crossed my mind. A shadow, fleeting, and I let him go, the fire a memory I no longer chased. I'd burned, fallen, but I was rising, piece by jagged piece. The road was long, littered with thorns, but I walked it. Mistakes had cost me everything. Passion had blinded me, desire had raised what mattered, but they'd taught me too. I'd never undo the pain, never reclaim what was lost, but I could live, could find meaning in the ashes. The diner's bell chimed, a customer's smile greeted me, and I smiled back, tentative, real. The void receded, not gone, but smaller, and I stepped forward into a life I'd forge alone. That's Sarah's story, a blaze of passion that cost her everything, yet led her back to herself. What would you do when desire clashes with duty? Drop your thoughts below, I'd love to hear. If this journey gripped you, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more tales of heartbreak and hope. Thanks for sticking with me through the fire and ashes. Wishing you all strength to face your own storms, peace in the quiet moments, and a spark of joy to light your days. See you in the next story.